I'm looking left, looking right. I think we've got everything up and running this morning. I want to say good morning to you all, my friends and family, as we start in on message number 10 on our post Easter messages. Um, I want to say thank you for sharing part of your weekend with me and my beloved Lisa. We have a lot for you. I guess that's kind of an expectation at this point. Uh, just a lot to bring out to you each Sunday, and I try my best to see to it that if you're going to share an hour with us, that I have some things worthy of you spending that hour with us. Okay, let's start with this. The message is going to cover the idea of seeing in a mirror. And the idea is that Paul and James both use this analogy of seeing your face in a mirror. And I want you to kind of see this differently today because we're going to be clearing up some bad teaching uh, as well as supplying the right teaching today, which sometimes that's what we do a lot of. When I compare the translations of what I look at in the Greek versus what the English translators have offered. Sometimes the difference does not automatically constitute a a a theology, a study of God. But sometimes what I notice is because the translation isn't 100% accurate, um, doctrines get created and then bondage follows. And that needs to be addressed when I see it. And that's on the table today. People uh, are not understanding Paul's writing about seeing this reflection in a mirror. He actually says we see in a mirror. Thank you, Chris. He says we see it in a mirror in an enigma. This thing of seeing. I think the NASB says we see in a mirror dimly. Uh, and from that point forward, the translators are under the impression that he's catapulted the conversation into the end time teaching when Jesus returns and we see each other face to face. Then at that time, we're going to have a clarity of what's going on. It's kind of like people have been taught that when Jesus returns, that's what Paul's writing about. You're going to have this, oh, okay, now I see what you've been, I see clearly. We have to address that today. And unfortunately, that's going to occupy some of our time. But if you don't clear it up, people are going to continue to be like a football play that's stepped out of bounds. They're going to keep snapping the ball even though the play's over. So we're going to address that today. And here's Lisa brought my water up and she put this on here because she said last week I didn't pray. Sometimes I get so, about 2 hours before we launch, I try to memorize things and sometimes I forget that we need to pray. So let's do that right now. Holy Father, if you do not build the house, we labor in vain. Father, there's no words I'm going to speak today that's going to give clarity to people unless you quicken the words. I ask you, Holy Father, give people understanding. Break through the enigma in the mind of this partial understanding and grant us clarity. Amen. Okay, I've got some new terms for you today. I got some feedback on the definitions that I supplied, and I thought, well, they liked them. I'm going to keep doing it so you can develop your own definitions, your little book of definitions, because when you come across these words, You're going to need to know these words. Kevin says, not getting anything, but Mr. and Mrs. Beck says they are. Hang on a second. So here's the thing that, we spent some time last week in the book of First Corinthians, and I just read it out of the NASB. Well, I told you uh, I was going to go ahead and uh, do my own translation, and you're going to see why it's so important to have the definitions and the terms spelled out. You have to have an understanding that is supplied to you by Jesus, because what's going on is James and Paul are using a picture of looking at a reflection in a mirror. And I want you to see this so that you can clearly understand why does Paul address the mirror and the idea of an enigma in his Corinthian letter. And you've heard me say that, and I'm going to bring this book out for you today. I wrote this book. Let me see if I can get it up in front of the camera. This book says Galatians. It says Paul's response to the letter of James. This book is now on Amazon. I finally got it finished. It took a year, but I've got the book now in an ebook format, a hard copy format, and a paperback. And why, are you into selling books now? Well, no. Here's what I want you to understand. If the Corinthian church would have had this writing, what I've written in this book, you would not even have the book of 1st, 2nd Corinthians, because the objective of Jesus is the same objective we have at K&L. What is that? The objective of Jesus was to teach a following about the new covenant faith practice that launched in an upper room 50 days after his ascension or his resurrection. The idea that you and I are supposed to be able, we're supposed to be able to hear and recognize wrong doctrine and avoid it. That's what this Galatian book has in it. It has the right lens for you to understand all of the New Testament. The very purpose for Paul writing Galatians was to address the letter of James. That's why the title of it is Paul's response to the letter of James. And the whole idea has to do with they see this mirror image completely differently. Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and I would imagine, I hate to put words in his mouth, but I'm almost certain I'm correct that his temperature is a bit up. You can see in 1st Corinthians, 2nd Corinthians, and then Romans, you can see the water pot boiling. You can see the Corinthian letter. Anybody that's ever watched water boil, you can kind of see the bubbles starting to form in the very bottom of the pot. That's 1st Corinthians. Then you can see the water boiling in 2nd Corinthians, and it just spills over the edges in Romans, because what he's doing is he is addressing the evangelists that were from Jerusalem that have went out behind Paul, and they are systematically visiting the churches Paul planted, and they are trying to convert each church away from Pauline doctrine. And so he's writing in the 1st Corinthians about the mirrors, that we see things partially. and we know things partially, but then with clarity. And he uses the word mirror, and you'll see it in our terms today, is only used twice. And it's not a coincidence that James uses it in James chapter 1, and I've got that slide too. And then Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And the reason I brought this book out today is not just that I finally finished it, but it's the idea that if you don't understand the teachings of Jesus that are written by Paul. Paul writes the constitution of the new covenant. He's the one that God gave the revelation to. If you don't understand it, you simply can't recognize bad teaching when you hear it. I wrote in this book, if you want to know why we have multi-denominationalism, it's not because of the teachers in the pulpits. That would be too easy to say, well, this guy's teaching wrong, that guy's teaching wrong. This pastor he's into name it and claim it. This pastor, he's trying to make money. That's too easy. The reason that you have multi-denominationalism is what Paul is addressing in his Galatian letter and all of his letters, is that the masses, the people, they're not recognizing false teaching when they hear it. And if they recognize false teaching when they hear it, you might not stop somebody from coming to a pulpit, but there'll be no audience. That's what he's addressing. He is engaging with his pen in 1 Corinthians, the Jamesian evangelists that are in Corinth. And in his second letter he actually in 2 Corinthians 11, he just calls them false apostles. They're fake. They're not teaching correctly. And then if you've ever wondered, why is Romans so drastically different than every other book? Why is it a systematic theology from start to finish? Well, the answer to that is he's finally made it to Corinth, and he's sitting across the table, and he's writing every evening. He's writing an addition to the letter of the things he engaged that day with the fake evangelists. So he's spelling out the faith practice in the book of Romans, because he wants the reader to say, you're not recognizing false teaching when you're hearing it. And that's the problem. False teachers can come and go, but you have to have what Jesus taught the 12 so that you recognize it. John actually called them the neanaskos, the new creations, the new men. I think they translate it young men. He says, I write to you neanaskos, because you've overcome the evil one. Well, the neanaskos is the idea of a new person, or a younger person, a new man that has been confronted with bad doctrine, but they're shaking their head going, no, 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 no. I'm not going there with you. I'm not practicing that. That is not the right teaching. That's not the right doctrine. I'm not doing it. That's overcoming. That's what he's writing about. So let's get into some of these terms so we can launch into this today. Let's see what we got. Seeing in a counterfeit mirror. There's me. Wrong slide. Okay, here's the first 10. These aren't new, so I'm going to skip over these. Okay, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, this slides are all new. And this is what I want you to start at the top with me. The new covenant terms to grow your faith to maturity. You have to grow your faith. Faith can be weak. Faith can be sick. Faith can be little. But the objective of God's new covenant is that new creations be constructed. New children of God are born again, but their faith is not mature. They're susceptible to leading astray. And the idea is believers must be able to identify Jamesian doctrine when they hear it. That's all that Paul's objective is to find those people that God the Father has given faith and give them the doctrinal support to grow their faith practice so that they're strong in their faith. They're no longer poor ones. They understand fasting of the mind. They understand what it means to confess your sins. All of those 1 through 10, they're growing in their understanding. So number 11, that Greek word is ecclesia. That's where you'll read the term church. Every time you come across the word church in your English translation, that's the Greek word. Now, we're letting faith help us to get the right definition so we understand. The idea of the church, the ecclesia, ek means to draw out, and kaleo is the verb. This is a noun. Ek, it's a two-part word. Ek and klesia. Ek means out from. Kaleo means to summon or to call. So we're not calling the world. We're calling the people that have been given faith. That's the way this term is used. It's those given faith are the summoned ones. They are the summoned ones, i.e., the church or the assembly. The assembled ones are the ecclesia. Okay? The second word. This word's translated edification, and it's almost telling that the only time this word is translated as edify is in the Corinthian letter. And I'll tell you, I just have to say it. I don't think the translators understand Paul's use of this word. Edification is a dartboard term. It's not really wrong. It's just on the outer ring and it doesn't hit the bullseye. But let's look at it. It too is a two-part word. The word oikos is the word for house, and the word domeo is a dome. You get the word a dome, like a football stadium has a dome over top of it. Well, the idea is to place a dome over a house is to build one's faith. The idea is put a dome over a house, a construction project. Half of the structure, a construction project, is to build the house. The other half is to complete it by putting a dome on it. Now, why is that so important? Because that's the very Greek word that the Septuagint translators used when they said that God took the rib from the side of Adam and he built a woman. Well, the idea is the rib is pointing to the idea of faith that comes from the male, which is Jesus in the new covenant. But in the early parts of the Bible, he's showing very early that there's a two-part construction project to create something for the image of God. The image of God is to be relayed from heaven to earth through the male and the female. That's just the way God designed it to be. And if you have one without the other, you're learning through a partial understanding. And that's what Paul is addressing in chapter 13 of the Corinthians when he says, I know in part and I see in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. He's referring to faith and partials. And we're going to get there today. But what I want you to see is the idea is faith is the rib, and to complete the building project is the dome. That's the woman. The woman is the completion of man because God constructed male, the human being, both male and female. One without the other is a partial, and it's not complete. So that's kind of the idea. When you see that Paul talks about edification, you'll see I don't use that word edification. You're going to see in my translation, I say house built. I would rather use that term so that you say, okay, he's already told us it is a house with a dome over it. Edification, see, it just muddies the water. Okay, the next one is a little bit more complicated. It's pronounced phroneo. And here's what it's the formulation of instinct. It's often translated as think. Now, I struggle with this week. I translated this word mind work. Mindwork, but I changed it and you'll see why here in a minute. But it's the starting point of faith as it restructures new creations thinking from their infancy. And I put in brackets, this is visceral formulation idea. And we're going to get to that in our slides. But what I want you to see, to apply the word think for that term is just not accurate enough. It's just not. It's much, much more complicated. It's the mind is being engaged. So is it thinking? Yes. Contemplating? Yes. But you're going to see why is that so important? Because Paul's going to use that word and say, when I was an infant, I phroneo, I thought like an infant, but I want you to see that word as it relates to faith. It's the starting point. And the next word is the Greek word for a mirror. It's also a two-part word. It's eis plus the future tense word for harao, which means to perceive. Perceive. So you're going to see we need to incorporate the understanding of perception in a mirror. So if you look in a mirror, the idea is you're looking at a reflection, but they're not really using it that way. It's more of a pejorative term in that one sees not the thing itself, but its polished metal, indistinct mirror image, as though another is offering a counterfeit definition of what you're seeing. Put in brackets the big lie here. It's the idea that your eyes are seeing something for itself, but another person is supplying the definition of what the reflection is. It's the idea of, you remember Isha in the garden, she's looking at this tree. But instead, she's saying, yeah, I see the tree and it's beautiful. It's to make me wise, but I'm not supposed to see it. I'm not supposed to touch it, certainly not to eat from it. And then you see this engagement of the enemy that he comes along and says, okay, let me supply you with a different understanding. That's the idea that's going on here. It's perception of what you're seeing back. It's not looking at a glass. The idea in their era was it was polished metal. So it's not like a modern day mirror where the image is crystal clear. Just imagine just kind of shining up a silver platter or something and looking at it. Do you see a reflection? Yes. Is it real clear? No. And the idea is that somebody else is coming along and saying, look, let me tell you what you're seeing here. That's the idea of the mirror. Okay, now the next one in Greek, listen to the Greek word, enigma. Enigma. Well, yeah, it sounds exactly like what we translate in English is enigma. An enigma is that which requires special insight to understand because it is expressed in puzzling fashion. Look what I put in brackets, looking into a mirror of another's eyes, plus supplying of a different understanding that is supplied. That's the serpent's ideology. It's an enigma. It's a puzzle. It's something that needs unscrambled. And Paul is using this word when he says we are looking in this mirror in the enigma. And what he's using it for, he's saying we have to have Jesus supply. We have to have from another source a supply, because we are only processing part of the picture. That's why he says, I know in part, I see in part. He's using that idea to say the problem is that the natural state of the human mind is only partially complete. We have the mind of the woman, and because of that partial knowledge, an enigma is present. We only see things through this polished metal thing that's just creating a reflection that's not totally understood. We need something. And the devil wants to come along and say, you're right, let me give you what you need to know. That's what's got us to 198 different Christian denominations. He is supplying the reflection. I mean, the definition of the reflection, and Paul is addressing it to the Corinthians, and he's saying, because you're not identifying those people you're permitting in your pulpit, you're letting them supply terms and definitions that don't need to be in the new faith covenant. And because of that, you're confused, that you're letting something in your ears, that you're supposed to identify it early and dismiss it. So, an enigma. James doesn't use the word, only Paul. So, we're going to look at that. And then the last one, number 16, is meros. It's simply part, and it means redeemed believers whose understanding is partial and not complete. That's the way Paul is using the term. That's the reason we wrote this, because you have to have the understanding of not just how these authors are using these terms. That's what you have to have, but you have to have a supplied, you have to have your Jesus has to be the other half of the partial. So when Paul is using that, you're going to see in his Corinthian letter, it's going to become crystal clear that Paul is simply addressing that there's an enigma, that we're trying to connect the dots, but we're using just this thing between our ears, and it's like a baby that's trying to put everything in its mouth. It's trying to smell things. A baby's trying to touch things. It's formulating. It's engaging this little thing up here all on its own. And that's why he's using the infant in his teaching. He's saying, look at a baby. A baby, it's tragic. God did not create Adam as a baby saying, okay, just toddle on through the created design. And when you come across a tree, try to figure it out. As you grow up, just develop your own database. No, he made a man of honor. The moment this man was born, he was born with the embedded understanding that we're supposed to have. He wasn't created as an infant. The idea of making babies was our thing. The male and the female was created to bring the righteousness of God into the created order. It wasn't so that we can make more in our image. It was so we can transport his image into the created order through the male and the female. The procreation aspect of humanity occurred after the fall, stood as Paul used them. The New King James